Hi, I'm Kat, and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome. This is a channel where I like to talk about books and ideas, and today I'm going to be talking about both of those things. Today we're going to be talking about heroes, about hero worship, and how we treat heroes when they fall, I guess. And that was all inspired by this book, Difficult Women. So let's get on into it. So they say that well-behaved women don't make history, but at the same time, difficult women often don't either. And this is actually what this book is about. In this book, Helen Lewis traces the fights of several difficult women who have taken up causes that are part of the feminist struggle throughout history. She talks about suffragists who resorted to violence in order to advocate for the vote, women who led strikes for equal wages, women who set up shelters for victims of domestic violence, as well as women who risked prison to challenge laws preventing abortion. One of the things I liked about this book was the women that she chose to cover. It's a combination of people we've maybe heard a bit about in history and people who we've really never heard of at all. And some of that is by design. She chose women who were not a giant part of feminist history, or at least not in the kind of like mainstream what's known about them. And she has a whole theme running through here in that these women were difficult, and that is one of the reasons why we don't hear a lot about them today. Now, I think it's a really normal thing in the media or throughout history to characterize any woman who does not conform to either the societal expectations of her day or the societal expectations of now as difficult. And this can be almost any woman who wants things for herself or other women and won't shut up when people tell her to. And all of these women were women who would not shut up about things that they cared about. Now, I generally like this book. I think it's well worth a read if you're interested in kind of the history of the feminist struggle and some kind of case studies about some of the characters that featured in that. But this video is actually not really about this book. This book really just gave me the inspiration for what I want to talk to you about today, which is heroes. So one of the things that the author points out in this book is that these women were not perfect. And in fact, she highlights the ways in which they weren't perfect. They did contribute to the feminist struggle in some ways, but in other ways they were kind of shitty. And that's one of the reasons that we haven't heard of some of them. So one of the examples of this from this book is Erin Pizzey, who in the 1970s set up a bunch of shelters for victims of domestic violence, but nowadays is a right-wing crank who advocates against feminism and for men's rights. The organization that grew out of the shelters that she started that now help thousands of women a year across Britain has distanced themselves from her, and they don't really mention her on their website. Now, to some degree, I get this. If you're a person or an organization trying to advance a cause, and that cause is heavily associated with a person who is in some way not a good person, who either doesn't agree with you on other issues that are kind of related to your cause, or has actively harmful views on those issues, or even has started advocating a contrary perspective since their involvement, I can understand why you as an organization or a representative of that cause would want to kind of write them out and not associate with them anymore. And that's absolutely fair for any organization or person. Now, sometimes I think we can go too far down one extreme or the other when we're dealing with messy characters from history, which is frankly all of them. I think with either historical or contemporary figures who in some way represent the ideals that you stand for, or who represent certain causes that you are heavily associated with and really believe in, to idolize these people and see their beliefs and morals and whatever and behavior as a metric almost for what is good. And that's just on an individual level. Nations and states often have a whole mythos surrounding certain historical figures who are key to their founding and their development as a country. And those figures can be very important to the nation's understanding of the origin of the state, its values, as well as its power and influence around the world. But often, usually, these people are not perfect paragons of virtue and righteousness, because really no one is. And this tends to lead to one of two extremes. Either we go down the path of forgiving them for everything bad that they've ever done and saying it was a different time, people believed different things back then. Or we go the other way and just go, let's ignore them, write them out. They're all horrible people and there's nothing good that they've ever done in the world. And these two extremes are really not useful to anyone. And so this is kind of what I want to talk about today. So I think it can be really easy to idolize someone, to use their beliefs and actions as a rubric for what you see as right. And this starts when we're young. We might do this with our parents or with our siblings or with older classmates or friends. And then certainly with public figures, people like musicians, artists, athletes, celebrities, and nowadays we'd probably add influencers to that list as well. And I think to some degree this is fine. We can't spend all day every day critically thinking about every opinion, concept, or thought that is presented to us, and to some degree we sometimes need shortcuts to just process things. So for me, for example, I read a good amount of nonfiction books, and when I go to the bookstore and I'm browsing nonfiction, sometimes it can be hard to tell from like the back of the book. You'll know like what the book is about, but often there will be an ideological undertone to a lot of nonfiction, especially when it's about like social issues. You'll be coming at it from a certain way. And I know the kind of axioms that I agree with, and so I don't want to waste my time when I'm trying to learn about a subject reading something from someone whose foundation is going to be different than mine. And so the first thing I do, if I'm not familiar with the author, is to go to the back of the book, look at their bio, look at what their history is, the kind of organizations that they advertise that they've worked for, and things like that, as well as people who might have blurbed the book. And that's really useful for me, because if I see that they have worked for, say, the Heritage Foundation, I know that I probably don't want to pick up that book, because they're going to be coming at that issue from a foundation that I'm just not going to agree with. And so it's not really useful for me to be looking at that in the first instance. Similarly, for almost any fiction or nonfiction book, I'm much more likely to pick it up if an author that I know and have enjoyed previously has blurbed it. And I think that's something that we all do. And so it's using other people as shortcuts. They like this thing, I'll probably like this thing too. They agreed with this, I'll probably agree with it too. Now, these are obviously shortcuts that I'm taking. It's not the end-all be-all of my thoughts on a certain subject, and it's not like the last time I'm going to learn about it. But I can only do so much assessment of, say, a book before I buy it without reading it, and so I have to take some sort of shortcuts in order to evaluate it before I do. So other people's beliefs can be a framework in which we start to build our own beliefs and our concept of the world, and this is where those intangible qualities of influence come in, and this is why we often hold people who have influence to certain standards. Now, obviously, there are different levels and degrees of influence. People like politicians have direct influence on our lives because they create laws and policies that impact us, but also so do the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. Through their companies, they decide whether or not they produce products, how to price them, what kind of environmental impacts they're going to have, how sustainable they're going to be, what their supply chains look like, how they pay their employees, all kinds of things that have direct influence on a lot of people's lives. There are a good number of very public-facing, rich and powerful people like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, who all exert influence over things like the economy, the environment, the online space, and also hundreds of thousands of people who work for them. But these people also exert indirect influence over a lot of people due to their status as well-known and generally by some people well-liked public figures in a way that, say, Andrew Whitty doesn't. Do you know who this guy is? He's the CEO of United Healthcare Group, which is one of the largest and most profitable companies in the world. They provide health insurance, and so he runs a giant corporation. But as far as I know, this guy doesn't even have a Twitter account. He doesn't have a big public presence the way that, say, Elon Musk does. So just by virtue of the fact that this guy is the head of a giant healthcare corporation and has great influence over a lot of people's health insurance, but also likely the insurance industry, the kind of medical system, all kinds of things that he contributes influence to. He's just an example of the fact that some people make it their business to have both direct and indirect influence over the general public, and that some people do have direct influence but haven't really cultivated a public persona in order to have that indirect influence. And the whole point of this illustration is really to get into the fact that I think in order to be a hero in that sense to any person on a more like macro level, not just to like your kid or someone you know, you have to have indirect influence in a very public way. And usually this comes with having a larger public profile, following, or cultural presence. Again, people like actors, musicians, athletes tend to fit the bill because they work in jobs that are intimately integrated with the production of our social culture in a way that someone like Andrew Whitty really isn't. And I would argue that indirect influence comes as much from the person themselves as the image that they've created, either they themselves creating that image or a PR firm or the public or a nation, for example, depending on whether you're talking about a contemporary or historic figure. If we take the image of the American founding fathers as an example, to some degree you could argue that they still exert direct influence over people because they set up the systems and the governments and the laws that we all live by today. But I would say that interpretation of those systems and enforcement of those laws and all that kind of stuff that is much more contemporary and dependent on whoever's in power at the time is probably much more important to people's day-to-day lives than whatever was set up by these guys in the past. However, I think that the image of these men still exerts a powerful influence over American life because their characters and lives and actions are part of our origin story as a country, and we want them to be representative of what we stand for as a nation. But that becomes harder when we scratch one layer under the surface of these Revolutionary War heroes and we learn about things like the fact that they owned slaves. They obviously never gave any rights to women when they were creating the country. They were probably racist, classist, sexist, all of the ists and bad things. And that feels really uncomfortable to us because they're supposed to be these great examples of what we stand for, and we don't want to stand for those things. And so when this happens, we go down one of those routes. And the first is to make excuses. It was a different time. Everyone was doing it back then. People just saw things differently. This is a very frequent argument for both historic and sadly contemporary figures. And there is something to be said about normalcy influencing people's actions. After all, if everyone's slapping the secretary's ass and she's not complaining about it, then it's probably okay, right? Obviously, this is not how we should think about things. Just because something is normal doesn't mean it's good or right or preferable. And we should always expect better of ourselves and be able to think critically about our actions and how they impact other people, even if other people don't necessarily speak up to tell us about that. But then, of course, we can go to the other extreme, which is what I think we now call cancellation. Now, I think cancel culture, that term, means different things to different people. For some people, it's just holding people accountable for saying bad things, for making hateful comments, and not platforming them, not giving them support, and not directing people to places where they're going to find hate. And a lot of people refer to this as accountability culture, just holding people accountable. On the other hand, this can be synonymous with dogpiling on a person and sending them hate and threats, and depending on what they said and who they are and what kind of power they have, this can be wildly out of proportion with whatever it is they said. Usually it's someone who just said something shitty on the internet and everyone just jumps on the hate train. And of course, this is all helped along by social media algorithms that prioritize engagement, whether it's good or bad, and often it's bad. And if you want to learn more about that, I recommend reading The Chaos Machine by Max Fisher. Trust me, it's chilling. And let's be clear, both of these interpretations of cancel culture can be true at the same time. They're different for different people, different circumstances, and all kinds of stuff. And so that's just one of the fun things about language and society. But cancellation can also happen to historical figures, just not in the same way that it happens when someone is still alive. And this can take the form of taking down statues, taking names off of buildings or off of programs or off of scholarships, or taking them out of history. Just be clear, I don't think there's a massive conspiracy or any kind of conspiracy to take any of these women out of history books or anything like that, but selectively choosing not to write about some people because they can put a bad face on something. And like we're talking about, there are reasons for and reasons against that. So I think we do have to find a middle ground sometimes where we can acknowledge someone's faults, but also acknowledge that they made contributions to whatever cause they were a part of. And the ultimate question we're trying to ask is, can we separate the person from the thing that they helped create? So if Erin Pizzey is now arguing for men's rights, did she just never do anything for feminism or the victims of domestic violence? If she were a more popular figure, an Elon Musk, for example, instead of an Andrew Whitty, would she have changed the face of that thread of the feminist movement or discredited it at all? Like I said, when we're talking about historical figures, we are almost exclusively talking about their image because they're not around anymore to be a person. They are just a concept in our heads now. Whereas if they're contemporary figures who are still alive, then they might be still around and profiting on something that they helped create. And so there's a whole other dimension of how do you support this thing, maybe without supporting the person. Can you do that? Can you divorce the two? And that's a hard question to answer. I think what Lewis did in this book by highlighting the contributions, the positive contributions that these women did make to the feminist struggle, while also pointing out that like they were shitty in some ways, was a really good choice. And I think this was a good way to address these issues, because you're not hiding the bad things, but you're also not invalidating the contributions they make, and you're showing that people are messy. And I think that the problem with going to either extreme of either full-on cancellation or just making excuses for someone obscures the fact that people are not perfect, and that most people are messy, and that this is something we have to accept about humans. Now, we can obviously always do better, and we should expect better, especially of anyone who has either direct or indirect influence over people. But sometimes I think that we can get so hung up in that we lose the bigger picture. And just to be clear as well, this is not saying that people should not be held accountable, or that people who committed actual crimes should not be prosecuted for those, because absolutely they should. But what I'm trying to say is that if we rely too much on single people to be heroes and to be these embodiments of moral and virtue and these rubrics by which we measure our life, then we're putting too much in single people, and we're also reducing our own ability to think critically about things and to think for ourselves about what is right, what is wrong, depending on what we believe, and also how we want the world to be. Going back to me browsing the bookstore, I don't buy books from people who advertise their involvement with the Heritage Foundation, not because I think that people who work for that organization are stupid or evil, but because I don't want to start my learning about a subject from a set of axioms that I think are false. So in saying this, I'm saying we shouldn't rely too much on who is saying the thing. We should think about the idea, we should think critically about things, but then at the same time, we get back to a dilemma, because when you're thinking critically about something, the messenger does matter. Who is advocating for a certain action is critical to understanding who benefits from that action and the intentions behind it. So a recent example of this is that in the US, there has been a push in the last few years to ban child marriages, so a marriage where one or both of the parties is under the age of 18. And this is still legal in some states, usually with parental consent. And there are obviously some ultra-conservative religious groups that don't want this ban. They want child marriage to be allowed. And if that were the headline of the news article, then I really don't need to read any farther, because I know why they want things. I disagree with them. I'm not going to be swayed by their argument, and so that's job done. But in recent articles, there has been talk about an unlikely coalition of parties who are advocating against a ban of child marriage. And this unlikely coalition was, on the one hand, the ultra-conservative religious groups, but on the other hand, the ACLU and Planned Parenthood, I think specifically in one state. And this was surprising for me, because generally I agree with the kind of work that the ACLU or Planned Parenthood does. And so I was very confused about why they thought child marriage was a good thing. And so I read the actual article to see if there was something interesting that they had to say. So specifically, these groups were concerned about a theoretical situation in which a 16-year-old girl gets pregnant and wants to marry the father of the baby before it's born. And this made me rethink the situation, because I hadn't really thought about that angle before. And I thought about it, and I can completely understand why a girl in this situation would want the option to get married. But of course, then I decided that I don't care. There is evidence that two-parent households are better for children. However, it's not causal. You don't just have a two-parent household and then everything's better for everyone else. Usually two-parent households are correlated with things like income and education and other things that tend to spell better lives for the people in that household. And so just getting married does not lead to either of these things. And so I don't think that that's a good enough reason why parents of children should just get married. And that's a whole other debate that we're just not going to have. But that's my view. But also, this article pointed out that of the 300,000 minors that were married between 2000 and 2018, most of these were not high school sweethearts who didn't get good sex ed and now wanted to get married so that they could raise their children. They were like 78% girls under the age of 18 who were marrying men over the age of 18. And again, some of these might have been 16-year-olds marrying their 18-year-old sweetheart, but I'm guessing not. So I decided, upon critically analyzing the situation, that Planned Parenthood and the ACLU were wrong in their assessment, and that whatever kind of niche situation in which child marriage might be in any way good for the child involved was probably not worth the much more likely situation where the minor is a victim of coercion and is going to be trapped in this legal partnership that they can't escape. There you go, critical thinking. And I can still generally believe that the ACLU and Planned Parenthood have good intentions and agree with them on a lot of issues without agreeing with them on this specific thing. So I know we just talked about a lot of things. We went from this book and some historical figures that did some good things, but also had some problematic beliefs, to not ignoring the bad things that people do while also not erasing them from history, to debating if there's an upside to child marriage, to which we have hopefully all agreed that it's not worth the inevitable downside. What I really want to get across is that I think it is natural to idolize and admire people, but we don't have to take an all or nothing approach where we either love them and they can do nothing wrong, or we hate them and they should just be erased from history and from our lives and from the internet and from like society. There's a middle ground. And of course, when it comes to actual crimes, we've also hopefully established that no one is above the law, despite what the US Supreme Court might say. I think in all of these situations, when you're considering a person who is maybe a historical figure that you like or a contemporary figure that you like, but they've done something wrong, it's important to just kind of like think about what the issue is to you, what the benefits of action or inaction are. But at the same time, when we're talking about historical figures, whether they be politicians, activists, artists, or literary figures, there's also a conversation that we need to have about how we teach history and the kinds of information that we present to people, say in textbooks, but then also around public works, statues, all that kind of stuff. And I realized in this video, I have been concentrating a lot on social movements, and that is on purpose. One, because this book was about the feminist fight, and that's a social movement, but there's probably a whole other argument to be made about art and artists and how you separate them, and that is very much talked about really all the time. Every time some musician or actor or something does something horrible, we have this conversation about, can you still like or consume or whatever their art without supporting them as a person? I think that is a separate conversation, because with social movements or with ideas or concepts or any of that kind of stuff, you are talking about a much more collective thing. They're very unlikely to be inexorably linked to that one person, the way a song is linked to a musician or a book is linked to an author. And also, depending on what it is, there might not necessarily be a financial incentive around a social movement the way that book sales or album sales or whatever, there's a financial incentive and there's a financial consequence to still supporting someone, in that if you literally give them money, you are supporting them. I think that's a separate conversation to be had, but obviously related to this topic. Anyway, I hope you liked this video and some of my hopefully semi-coherent ramblings on some things that I thought about after reading this book. I would recommend this book if you're interested in feminism and some like case studies around some feminist fights. These are some interesting kind of figures to dig into and understand kind of why they were the way that they were. If you have any thoughts on anything that I've talked about today, please feel free to share down in the comments. Please be respectful. I know that we've been talking about some issues that get people really fired up, and rightfully so. I hope you liked this video. If you liked it, please like, and if you'd like to see more from me, please subscribe. I hope you're having a great day wherever you are, and I hope to see you in my next video. Thanks very much. Bye.